When you think of European wealth, you probably picture kings and queens, right? Well, forget the famous monarchs for a minute. There's another layer, a sort of hidden aristocracy that's been shaping the continent for centuries. And we're not talking about today's tech billionaires, we're talking about dynasties whose wealth is measured in generations. Because, well, it has been. These are families that don't really do headlines. They prefer the shadows, but their influence is woven into the very fabric of Europe, often hidden in plain sight. So today, we're going to pull back that curtain. Okay, first things first, we've got to get this straight. The difference between old money and new money. New money, that's your tech IPOs, your disruptive startups, fortunes made in a flash, and they love the spotlight. Old money is the complete opposite. It comes from legacy, usually land, and it's been cultivated over centuries. Its most important feature? Discretion. So let's start with our first theme, which I like to call the invisible architecture. This is all about how the most enduring power comes from the ground up, quite literally. It's wealth built on property, on land. So how much are we talking about? How about this number? Over 10 billion pounds. That's the rough net worth of the Grovener family, led by the Duke of Westminster. You know, that makes him way wealthier than the British monarch. So how on earth did one family end up owning some of the most expensive dirt on the planet? Believe it or not, it all goes back to a single, very strategic marriage way back in 1677. The dowry was 500 acres of what was basically swamp and pasture outside of London. But over 300 years of patient, careful development, that patch of mud was transformed into Mayfair and Belgravia, two of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the entire world. And this quote just nails the whole strategy for these landed aristocracies. It's not just the Groveners. You see the same playbook with families like the Percys, the Dukes of Northumberland, who have been a power in northern England for, get this, almost 1,000 years. Their power comes from owning 100,000 acres of land, and from assets like this, Alnwick Castle. It's been in their family since 1309. And yeah, if it looks familiar, it's because you probably know it as Hogwarts from the Harry Potter films. A pretty cool way to introduce your ancestral home to a whole new generation, right? All right, so we've seen how wealth can grow from the soil. Now, let's shift gears and look at the fortunes that were forged in the fires of the Industrial Revolution. These are the families who didn't just own the landscape, they built the machines that changed it forever. To be, not to be seen. That is the motto of the Wallenberg family in Sweden. People often call them the country's silent rulers. And for good reason. For over 160 years, they've been the quiet engine behind Sweden's biggest industrial giants, always choosing influence over fame. And this really shows you what we're talking about. I mean, look at this. At their peak in the 1970s, the companies they controlled made up a staggering 40% of the Stockholm stock market's total value. They employed 40% of the country's entire industrial workforce. We're talking Ericsson, Electrolux, AstraZeneca, all Wallenberg companies. And you see a very similar story over in Italy with the Angeli family, often called the uncrowned kings of Italian industry. It all started with a car company, Fiat. But from there, they built a global empire called Exor, which now controls everything from Ferrari supercars and Jeep trucks to The Economist magazine and the Juventus football club. You know, sometimes an empire just starts with one incredibly gutsy move. What you're looking at here is the length of the lease Arthur Guinness signed for his brewery in Dublin back in 1759. For just £45 a year, he locked down the foundation for a global brand that's been flowing for more than 250 years. Talk about long-term thinking. Okay, so we've had land, we've had factories, but now we turn to the dynasties that built their fortunes on something way more abstract, something you can't even touch, the flow of information and money itself. The Rothschilds basically wrote the playbook for international finance. It was genius, really. From a ghetto in Frankfurt, the founder, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, sent his 5 sons to the 5 most important financial centers in Europe. They created their own private network, a family network, that could move money and, crucially, information faster than kings or armies. And long before we had email or even national postal services, there was the Thurn and Taxis family. Starting way back in the 15th century, they built and controlled Europe's first major postal service. It was a monopoly that made them princes and incredibly wealthy, all by controlling the flow of information. But think about it. What happens when your core business, a monopoly you've held for centuries, just disappears? As nations form and decide to run their own mail, how does a family like that even survive? Well, they adapted brilliantly. The Thurn and Texas family took all those immense profits they'd made from their postal empire and they pivoted. They invested in the most timeless asset there is, land. They became one of Germany's biggest private landowners, basically future-proofing their fortune for generations. So, what's the common thread here? When you look across all these different families, the landowners, the industrialists, the bankers, a pretty clear playbook for long-term survival starts to emerge. It's really the art of staying rich. You see the same strategy again and again. First, they think in generations, not financial quarters. They diversify like crazy, turning profits from their main business into timeless assets like land or art. They're masters of the pivot, adapting when their industries are threatened. And, maybe most importantly, they use complex trusts to protect their wealth. And they keep a low profile, letting their influence do the talking behind the scenes. Which kind of leaves us with one big question. These dynasties, they've survived wars, revolutions, total economic collapse, but can they survive our modern world, a world of nonstop technological disruption and radical transparency? Can this ancient, quiet form of power really endure? Well, that remains the multi-billion-dollar question.